Welcome, everyone. I'm Rosario Pisa, the chair of the Department of Gender and Women's Studies. Tonight, Dr. Amelia Moore will present the Dana Shugar Colloquium lecture titled At the Island's Edge, Living and Learning within Intersectional Ecologies. While listening to the lecture, I encourage you to like, share, and comment on social media. And now, a little bit about the College of Arts and Sciences.
Nobody is going to ever replace the capacity of a human. And this is why thinking is our number one obsession.
What's great about URI, especially in arts and sciences, we're a liberal arts college within a bigger school. And so you get that liberal arts feel, but you also get the ability to do research. We, as the flagship school of our state, do cutting edge work.
You have to really look at schools as a place to grow as yourself. You're not going to be handheld anymore. This is a time for you to really delve into yourself and find what you like. It needs to be somewhere that you're going to find to be a home, but also a place to build yourself. And I think that URI does a great job of that.
Students learn when they engage and get their own hands in that material. You're going to construct knowledge. You're going to do research. That's what creates transformative experiences. That's what creates people who are passionate about learning.
Rather than simply acquiring a body of knowledge, they themselves are developing in a way that keeps them agile, constantly able to re-educate themselves, constantly able to think critically, to adapt to new ways of learning, new ways of thinking, and to keep evolving throughout the course of a life.
Undergraduate liberal arts education is so transformative to the mind, to who you are.
The humanities and the arts are there to help you explore the fringes of what's possible, and understanding how you can look at the world in new and different ways and be ready whenever changes happen.
Multiculturalism and multidisciplinarity are very important because it gives you a unique perspective. You see students are actually excited to see people that think about problems from a different perspective. Problem solving can be attacked from different point of view.
It's nice to be able to come to a school where there's like so many different narratives, so many different perspectives. There's a place for everybody.
I think really what URI has to offer is the people and the opportunities. The people around you, they're all going to help you grow in ways that you've never understood before.
I think there's a lot of people, students in particular, that are just excited that whatever field they're in, they want to be the best at it. There's a sense of pride in the work that you put out there, and I think that's kind of infectious.
A College of Arts and Sciences education gives you the confidence to bring together all the strands that you value and apply them in ways that are fulfilling for you as an individual, but also resonate out.
The thing that sets URI apart is that we as a faculty and as an institution ask our students not just what you can do, but who can you be.
We're a small place, there's no denying that. I kind of think we're like a best kept secret.
Welcome back. I wish to thank the College of Arts and Sciences, the faculty and students of the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, and especially Dr. Amelia Moore for making this event possible. Every year, the Dana Shugar Colloquium features several distinguished URI scholars whose subjects and expertise continue to honor the courage, originality, and brilliance of Dr. Dana Shugar, a professor of English and Gender and Women's Studies, who in 2000 passed from breast cancer. The scholars all doing cutting-edge research and writing in fields pertinent to gender and women's studies, are invited to present their work, knowing how important their findings and methods will be for expanding our knowledge of the ways gender works in every aspect of society. After the lecture, we will hold a question and answer period. Please type any questions in the chat section, and we will select several for our speaker to address. And now, I wish to introduce our distinguished scholar, Dr. Amelia Moore. Dr. Moore is an associate professor of marine affairs at the University of Rhode Island. She has a PhD in sociocultural anthropology and a background in environmental biology, feminist science studies, and island studies. Her research includes collaborations in the Bahamas, Indonesia, and the state of Rhode Island. Published in 2019, her first book, Destination Anthropocene, Science and Tourism in the Bahamas, won the 2020 Nelson Grauburn Prize from the Anthropology of Tourism Interest Group. In 2020, Amelia Moore and Dr. Kendall Moore, a URI professor of journalism, were awarded the National Science Foundation grant to produce a documentary film whose working title is Decolonizing Science. Amelia and Kendall are currently in production with that project until 2022. Most recently, she has begun to explore historical and contemporary connections between ecology, race, gender, and supremacy within the field of marine science and policy. Let's welcome Dr. Amelia Moore.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming to this talk, and thank you to Rosaria for that nice introduction, and thank you for letting me speak today. My talk is centered around my experiences as a woman of color in the American Academy, spanning my 40 years on Earth, focusing primarily on the last 18 years of learning. I'll begin by giving you some insight into my own positionality and relevant life history, and then I'll describe 3 projects that have shaped the way I think and work as an anthropologist of the Anthropocene. Studying interdisciplinary conservation science in the Bahamas revealed the contours of the Anthropocene Islands as an emergent neo-colonial destination brand. Working with a coral restoration project in Indonesia made me aware of the global politics of witnessing. And learning to see the island of Manisses helped me recognize the erasure of the indigenous and African American past and the attempted foreclosure of an indigenous and African American future. I'll conclude by sharing how some of these insights have come to matter for my own situated academic practice within the life sciences, and I'll share some examples of the scholars who currently help illuminate my own understanding of supremacist global environmental change. I earned tenure last summer, and some of you listening may recognize the feelings I'm currently experiencing. I'm in a period of stock taking. I'm reflecting on where I've been and on what I want to do with the opportunity I've been given. This feeling seems to mirror the current American moment in which we've been through an acute intensification of racial trauma in the midst of a global pandemic. And of course, we recently had an election followed by an attempted insurrection, and now after a second round of presidential impeachment, we're taking stock and reflecting on how on earth we got here and what on earth we are going to do next. This talk is an attempt to harness the collective reflective moment for myself, but also to see if my reflections might resonate with you wherever you are in your life path. My goal is to connect events in my own life to key projects in my career, to key intellectual interlocutors who've emerged to guide me, and to critical conversations about global environmental change. I'm an environmental anthropologist, but in some ways, I hope I can begin to model how we might all reflect on this change as members of a scholarly community oriented around intersectional ethics. So you have to know a bit about who I am to understand where I am now in the physical, intellectual, and ethical sense. Today, I'm a woman of color living in New England, but I grew up mixed in the Pacific Northwest. Before I was born, my parents escaped to Seattle from the various segregated communities of their youth. My mother was descended from enslaved people, at least one of whom ran away to freedom from the South to the state of Rhode Island generations ago. But she was born back in the South and raised in the African American community surrounding Tuskegee University, where her parents were both English professors. My father split his childhood time between his father's house in Missouri and his mother's house in Florida, on the white side of Jim Crow apartheid in both states. My younger brother and I grew up in a predominantly white middle-class community, looking like we do, bathed in the privilege of ambiguity, only dimly aware of this heritage and the fact that we were part of a family of African American educators and activists who had long struggled to carve a path for others to follow and who depended on so many others to set them on that path. My mother patiently held me to educational standards I didn't always fully appreciate because she wanted me to know what I shared with her, her cousins, her aunt, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother. And that is what it means to be an accomplished, driven Black woman. My particular story matters because it provides me with one perspective from which to attempt, along with many accomplices, to revise the dominant conversation about the nature of crisis and responsibility. Growing up in Seattle was a lesson in American white supremacist myopia. But of course, I didn't realize I was being schooled. As a child, I had no idea that the house my family lived in was part of a neighborhood that had expressly excluded Black people from home ownership at the time of its founding in the 1940s. I had no idea that there was a multi-generational community of African Americans that had long called the Central District of the city their home, struggling to survive through the gentrification of successive tech booms. And while there were, and still are, surface-level celebrations of what we called Native American culture all over the region, including the name of the city of Seattle itself, I had no idea that successive waves of white settlers looking for timber and other resources had pushed the original indigenous inhabitants of the Northwest Coast onto reservations while deforesting, overfishing, polluting, damming, dredging, filling in, and paving over the land to create the urban infrastructure I took for granted. For example, the Duwamish people lived in what is now known as metropolitan Seattle, and they are not recognized by our federal government even now. As an adolescent, I worried about fitting in, but I didn't know enough to worry about what I was trying to fit into. Today, I'm reflecting on what it means to be the recipient of these interwoven complex legacies in the midst of multiple, compounding, and inextricably entangled crises. There's the crisis of extinction and global climate change. There's the current pandemic and its future manifestations. There's the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. The ongoing crisis of white supremacy and extractive colonialism, which still thrives in all our circles. There's the crisis of the underrepresentation of intentionally minoritized groups, especially pertaining to, but not limited to, Black and Indigenous folks within and well beyond the academy. There's the crisis of unprecedented economic polarization and the ever-widening wealth gap between the incredibly rich and the rest of us. Am I, and are we, capable of understanding all of this as one holistic and perpetuating conjunction? What do these compounding crises look like on the ground? I've found, quite by accident, that when combined with a critical consciousness, islands offer a certain vantage to help us reframe our personal and scholarly orientations. I want to take you to 3 different island locations to show you what I mean. But this is no Darwinian voyage of discovery. Think of this instead as more like being visited by 3 spirits. My recent book, published in 2019, describes what I call the Anthropocene islands of the Bahamas. This is the shortest of the 3 examples, and if you want to know more, you can always check out the book. I spent much of my 20s, my years as a graduate student, chasing after Euro-American conservation scientists, trying to catch them in the act of making biocomplexity theory, also known as coupled natural and human systems theory, visible and tangible through a number of linked projects across several islands and keys in the Bahamian archipelago. I participated in social data collection in tiny fishing settlements. I visited field research stations, and I watched many science divers plunge into aquatic caves to look for planetary history and fall backwards over the sides of boats to measure the spread of invasive species in coral reef ecosystems. At that time, in the mid-2000s, I was deep into science and technology studies, and I believed that the post-colonial racial politics of the Anglophone Caribbean was in the midst of being somehow transcended by new debates about ecology, anthropogenic climate change, and human environmental relationality. My head was filled with Bruno Latour, Michel Foucault, Donna Haraway, and their many disciples. But as time went on, I came to realize that the international tourism industry had far more power in the Bahamas than science and scientists, and that the Bahamian tourism brand remained steeped in violently racist manifestations of leisure, labor, and space. I could see how the interdisciplinary environmental science I was studying was framed and constrained by this pervasive and deeply material supremacy. The Anthropocene sciences cannot transcend the supremacist landscape. In fact, Anthropocene science helps reproduce it. In the Bahamas, environmental science and tourism are bedfellows. The capitalization, racialization, and institutionalization of emergent sustainable paradise travel branding aligns with scientific research about small islands as the frontline canaries in the coal mine of global change. And together, the science and tourism industries are redesigning an archipelago in the image of a fragile planet as a means of diversifying the regional tourism portfolio. From sun, sand, sea, and sex on the beach to marine protected areas, coral restoration voluntourism, invasive lionfish ceviche, of which this is an image, and vulnerable island ecologies, the industry adapts with no trace of irony. These forms of sustainable tourism certainly do sustain the Bahamas as a kind of neo-colonial laboratory for Euro-American Anthropocene research and tourism brand development. In this framing, the racialized Black local becomes synonymous with ignorance and the requisite capacity building and outreach. But foreign white researchers and their students, along with elite travelers who seek out eco-experiences, become global Anthropocene subjects. They're simultaneously leaders in planetary conservation and consumers of sustainable destination branding. Prior to Hurricane Dorian, which slammed the Bahamas in September of 2019, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which slammed all of us in March of 2020, the Bahamas welcomed a record-setting 7 million annual visitors by jumbo jet, cruise ship, charter boat, and private plane. Think of the carbon emissions, waste, and consumption, all of which were sustained until our compounding crises forced the country into lockdown. At this moment, the Bahamas is experiencing the storm violence of climate change, dozens dead, over 1,000 missing, the globalized violence of the pandemic, over 100 people dead, thousands of cases and thousands of jobs lost, and the everyday violence of supremacy, which has kept the country dependent on foreign investment in tourism and reliant on foreign scientific expertise. My second example takes us to another island region on the other side of the planet, and to a project which is still ongoing, although currently paused by COVID. In my first year here, 6 years ago, my dean asked faculty in my college if we'd be interested in working with a large multinational company to help them monitor a coral restoration project they had already begun in the Spermande archipelago in Indonesia. I'd seen some examples of coral restoration at work in the Bahamas, mostly at the hands of small non-governmental organizations, so I wondered how a private company was going about designing a large-scale restoration project. I was also new and eager to please, So I somewhat naively agreed to participate along with a few other colleagues and other students, and our students. I don't have the time to get into all of the details with you here. And you can look at the work of Jessica Vandenberg, who recently published on the topic, who is one of our students, now graduated, Dr. Jessica Vandenberg. But for me, this example hinges on the rhetorics of representation, to use the language of one of my mentors, Paige West, surrounding the crisis of planetary coral reef death due to warming and acidifying seas, blast fishing, and pollution, and coral restoration as an increasingly popular response to that crisis. So in other words, how we witness coral life and death matters. Here's an example. The company designing the coral restoration project posted a video to their website last year. I can't show you this video to protect the island community and their anonymity, but the video opens with an underwater coral rubblescape. Somber piano music plays over the empty seabed. Text at the bottom of the screen reads, and you can imagine it there, 90% of coral reefs are predicted to be lost by 2040. It's not clear exactly where this filming is occurring, but the website says these are scenes from the company's coral restoration site. The images switch to above water scenes from a rural island that most Euro-American viewers might identify as being somewhere in the global south. I know it as a small island in the Spermonde, but the video does not mention that. There are images of colorful wooden homes and running brown children, accompanied by livelier music. The screen reads, "Our business and the many communities we source raw materials from depend on the ocean and its reefs. So we've stepped up to help." The scene then shifts to show a small group of men and women making the simple metal structures the company has designed to use in their restoration process. A group of non-European looking people are shown painting the hexagonal steel structures with resin and then dipping them in piles of coral sand to create the finished coating. The screen reads, "They are built by local communities using locally sourced products." We see the freshly assembled reef structures being loaded onto motorboats and transported to a shallow area where smiling, nameless male community members stand in the sea and tie coral fragments to the structures resting on floating pontoon tables. This is followed by unidentifiable wet-suited snorkelers placing the stars on the seafloor, followed by equally unidentifiable divers and scuba gear attaching them to the seabed in a grid pattern. Suddenly, the screen shifts to show what our eyes might consider to be a perfect reef, filled with pointy staghorn and table corals of different colors and textures, swarming with schools of little fish. The transition comes with a rush of exultant music. The screen reads, "Within 20 months, the restored reef structures provide 60% coral cover, rich in abundance and diversity." An unidentifiable diver hovers over the thriving reef, spreading their arms wide as if to say, "Look at all the abundance." The screen reads, "After 3 years, the impact of the reef structures is even more inspiring." The video shows close-up images of different corals and their multifaceted polyps. The screen reads, "Supporting life both within and beyond the reefs." We then see images of a sea turtle, a larger grouper-like fish, and a reef shark. The last words on the screen are, "We know our business cannot thrive unless the planet and the people we rely on also thrive." We see a cuttlefish and then another sea turtle. Finally, the screen flashes the company logo and fades to black. The video can be currently found on both the company's website and on YouTube. Working in this restoration project, we found ourselves plunged into a neo-colonial drama for the ages, also known as business as usual in the corporate social responsibility world. There's so much that can be said of even this one small example of the politics of witnessing coral restoration, but for now I'll keep it brief. This video is clearly designed for Euro-American investors and consumers, not for the rural fishing community of islanders whose reefs are in the process of being restored. It brands the company's restoration project as an aesthetically smooth transition from local degradation to verdantly restored reef functioning via successful community-based engagement and innovative design. The prime mover is the benevolent private multinational company. But this video obscures far more than it could ever reveal. For starters, the video does not reveal the company's own role in the industrial scale extraction of fish and other marine resources in Indonesia, or its own role in global carbon emissions in the production and transportation of its products. It does not reveal the ways in which the company's own expansive role in Indonesia mirrors that of the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century, or many more recent corporate ventures, in that it has become the de facto driver of governance in this small island. The video also neglects to reveal any of the complexity of the small island community the company purports to rely on, which has been grappling with the arrival of company representatives who've organized the restoration project with local government officials and devised the plan to compensate islanders for their labor in the deployment of the reef structures. The community is also has to accommodate representatives from a regional Indonesian university who come to survey them about their involvement in a restoration project, along with dozens of Euro-American scientists and researchers who come to view and monitor the restored reef areas, and that includes me. Islanders have had to reckon with the expansion of re-territorialized protected area space in the waters surrounding their home, the disruption of inter-island relationships tied to reef fishing in the archipelago, and with concerns over the inequitable distribution of restoration jobs and benefits around the island. And of course, they also wonder about the future. What will happen to the reef and to their island's economy once the company finishes its project and exits the area? There is, as yet, no direct evidence that restored reefs will positively affect fish abundance in the long term, and it's too early to know how well these reefs will stand up to storms, warming seas, human disturbance, and the complex living conditions of the Spermonde. Our team's surveys find that most islanders support the restoration project in some way. But after many hours of open-ended conversation with residents, my team has determined that this support has little to do with caring for coral and more to do with monetary compensation and the island's new affiliation with what are perceived to be powerful, wealthy, Western white interests. But the video removes island people from their situated context to make them into Instagrammable brown stewards of decontextualized reef matter. The island, the coral, and the islanders in this unnamed part of Indonesia will now circulate online as long as the company wants them to. As a witnessing tool, the video may be more valuable to the reputation of the company and the expansion of their global restoration goals than to the actual islanders and their actual reef. The video can have a life of its own, no matter what happens to these specific coral and these specific people in the future. My last example brings me back to my current home in the state of Rhode Island, and to a project that remains active at this very moment. I didn't have the capacity to see Manisses when I moved to take up my position in 2015. I had never heard of the word or the island before, and I'd never even heard of the conventional settler name for the place, Block Island. I'm trained as a sociocultural anthropologist, so you might think that learning to see Manisses comes easier to me than most. But at first I only saw the turbines in what is known as the Block Island wind farm. I was fascinated by the introduction of this new infrastructure into the regional fishing and sailing seascape, and I wanted to know how the people and businesses of the region were adapting, or not, to something as massively visible as America's first offshore wind farm. I joined a research team in 2016 to investigate this question for the federal government. My colleagues and our government funders knew a lot about energy transitions, infrastructure, and public assessment, but they knew nothing, and therefore could teach me nothing about something as hidden as Manisses. In retrospect, there were signals that Manisses was all around me while I was doing fieldwork on Block Island, but I didn't know what I was seeing or hearing. Local residents would tell me about the struggle to build the wind farm and how disruptive the construction process had been in their daily lives. There were whole weeks when the process was shut down because the earth-moving operation to bury the energy cables connecting the turbines to the onshore grid had encountered archaeological sites that required investigation. What was the wind farm construction unearthing? Most residents didn't really know. As part of my research goal to understand the appeal of the island for regional tourism, I would often ride a bicycle all over the island on summer days, reveling in the smell of sun-baked wildflowers and meadow grasses along the roadways. If I had time, I would sometimes ride to one of the natural areas of the island and go for a little hike. More than 44% of the island is held in conservancy in perpetuity. It is said by the island's conservancy organization that this achievement provides recreational areas, preserves scenic views, protects crucial habitats for rare plants and animals, and protects the natural recharging of the island's sole source aquifer, its only water supply. But the Conservancy said nothing about Manisses. And there was the Island Museum, which told the stories of the dead white men whose names are embossed in Settlers Rock, whose tombstones are featured prominently in the island's main cemetery, and whose descendants still annually celebrate their arrival. Some rooms of the museum also displayed unearthed cultural materials and models representing the way people used to live on the island before European invaders and the founding families changed the place forever. I perused the contents of these rooms in my spare time. I was looking for examples of early forms of energy infrastructure on the island, but I could not see Manisses staring back at me from the shelves. So, although Block Island has a richly documented settler history, along with this museum that displays archaeological materials from the deep past, public memory has erased the contemporary presence of Black and Indigenous people on the island. This process of erasure has been so successful that nearly all public reference to Indigenous and African American life on the island is in the past tense. Popular lore claims that the last Indian to live on the island, Isaac Church, died in 1886. This is an image of the Indian cemetery on the island. That's what they call it. And the only African American to live there, Fred Benson, died in 1996. Both of these claims are apocryphal. The so-called last Indian had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and there are records of African slaveholding and several different waves of Black migration to the island over many generations. But these erasures have enabled the solidification of settler narratives and the uncomplicated use of valuable island space for tourism and vacation home real estate. Essentially, for most Block Islanders, and for the legal procedures of the state and federal government, there are no populations of Indigenous or African Americans on Block Island, and Manisseans no longer exist. Today, several of my colleagues and I, including a mix of folks in arts and sciences and cells at URI, are collaborating with a Black Indigenous island family and many other partners on an ambitious project to remind New Englanders of the island's original name in the Narragansett Indigenous language, Manisses, and to explore the underappreciated history of the survival of the island's Indigenous and enslaved people. Our goal is to re-narrate the history of Block Island from the perspective of Indigenous and African Americans, beginning with the intermingled presence of coastal Narragansett, Wampanoag, Niantic, and Pequot peoples before the arrival of the 16 founding white settler families in the 17th century, and proceeding all the way to this very moment. At this point, you might be wondering what this has to do with global environmental change. So let me try and show you by bringing us back to the wind farm. New England offshore energy development is a legal process that perpetuates settler colonial hierarchies even as it promotes alternative sources of energy. The recognition of Indigenous peoples in this process is complicated, to say the least. Although there's a legal prioritization of members of federally recognized tribes as certain kinds of stakeholders in offshore development planning, members from some non-federally recognized tribes have mixed access to these processes. For instance, members of the federally recognized Narragansett tribe participated alongside Nipmuc tribal members of Massachusetts, who are recognized by the state but not the federal government, in the Block Island wind farm planning process. But of course, no Manisseans were included in the project. Indeed, the term Manissean does not even appear in the best practices report that resulted from the collaboration between Native peoples and scientists involved in the Block Island wind farm. The inconsistent inclusion of people of indigenous descent illustrates the historically complicated relationship between the extractive US government, settler society, and indigenous populations, and can help perpetuate the myth of indigenous extinction in the region. Further, the governmental planning processes that legally mandate cultural heritage research in the siting of energy infrastructure may also perpetuate static visions of indigenous cultures. Although scientists involved in the Block Island wind farm planning process noted the problematic nature of using the term prehistoric to describe material culture identified during explorations of submerged sites, because prehistoric implies the history begins only with European occupation of the Americas, their substitution of the prefix paleo, as in paleo landscapes and paleocultural sites, as referring to older ancient times without reference to any particular time period, continues to relegate indigenous peoples' presence to the relatively safe distance of ancient history. Energy transition in the form of offshore wind farms is big business in New England today. The Block Island wind farm was the first in the US, but it was really just a pilot for the massive expansion of offshore wind turbines all along the Atlantic seaboard. The draft environmental impact statement for another offshore wind development in the region is a case in point for what that might mean for American coastal indigenous groups. It references legally mandated ongoing consultations with 6 federally recognized tribes, but restricts the potential impacts of the wind farm on the tribes to the cultural, historical, and archaeological resources section of the report. In doing so, this process may perpetuate the idea that indigenous peoples are part of prehistory, archaeology, and the deep past, with no acknowledgement that the development of industrial-scale offshore wind might affect them in other ways concerning access to energy or to energy politics. So while some tribes do appear as legally mandated stakeholders in the planning process for offshore wind, tribal agency over energy transition is actually quite limited in practice. Energy transition here is another form of settler supremacy. For our team, this work raises questions about the process of energy transition on the island and in the region. Can energy transitions ever be designed to have decolonial potential? What would that look like in this case, and for the continued development of offshore wind? Do these concerns require that we shift our scholarly attention away from depoliticized conversations about the social acceptance of new infrastructure among static stakeholder populations? Could recognition justice of the past, present, and future become as important as procedural and distributive justice frameworks, which tend to assume we already know who and what matters? What do we actually want energy transitions to enable? This question seems even more keenly important at this very moment. Just a week ago, I learned that the latest multi-million-dollar offshore wind enterprise in Massachusetts has been named Mayflower Wind, explicitly honoring the first European settlers in New England, again without any trace of irony. For me, the island regions of the Bahamas and the Spermonde and the island of Manisses are not just societal microcosms or living laboratories, although we can see how they can certainly be manipulated by the branding, witnessing, and erasing practices of supremacist industries. But thanks to my own observations and the guidance of others who've helped open my senses, I've begun to think of these islands and many other situations around the world as examples of intersectional ecologies. What does that mean? My answer is still in formation, but fortunately we don't have to think about this on our own. We're guided by many scholars who know that the longue durée patterns of injustice, extraction, and exploitation that have shaped this world also include our bodies and the beings, landscapes, and systems we know today. The well-known legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw is one guide on my journey, although she's not commonly cited and related to planetary change. Her term intersectionality speaks to the relations of power that undergird the way people, ideas, and things get classified and ordered. She writes about institutionalized social categories like race and gender, and the blindness of governance structures that cannot understand how these categories are inextricably interconnected to disproportionately negate or subjugate whole swaths of human lived experience. Scholars like Crenshaw show me that there is, of course, no such thing as anthropogenic climate change or environmental degradation without this messy history of social categorization, hierarchy, and rampant supremacist imperialism. There is no sea level rise, mass coral death, coastal erosion, or mass extinction without this history. And in turn, environmental conservation, sustainable development, renewable energy transition, and ecological restoration seem to all proceed along this same path laid out by supremacy, the path made to reproduce the world in the image of those who seek to exploit it. We can continue down this path, although we already know where it ends, or we can stop the branding, the market-based solutions, the hierarchical networks, the greenwashed rhetorics, and the supremacist master planning, and reorient ourselves towards new ends. We need a massive reframing of the mainstream environmental conversation that begins and ends with environmental justice, climate justice, social justice, racial justice, decolonial justice, economic justice, and on, simultaneously and perpetually. This involves all of us, and therefore all of you listening. Toward that end, I want to briefly expose you to a few more scholars who can help guide you towards more intersectional work between the social sciences, humanities, and life sciences, personally and professionally. These women speak to me. June Jordan, Alexis Pauling-Gums, Sylvia Winter, Catherine McKittrick, Christina Sharp, Tiffany Lethabo-King, Banu Subramaniam, Angelique Nixon, Max Liberon, Leah Thomas. Some of these scholars are no longer with us. Some of them are not well known outside of the silos in which their work is slotted, but they act at the intersection of race, gender, nationality, sexuality, and class to make critical connections explicitly visible within the supremacist conditions that would otherwise obscure them. Their work also bolsters the transdisciplinary field of Black feminist ecologies and Indigenous futures. Some of that may be familiar to some of you. Here are some examples of their work that's helping to inspire many connections for me and so many others. I'm still in the middle of this reading that spans decades of material. For example, Some of Us Did Not Die contains essays from the 60s, the 70s, and 80s. Undrowned just came out last year, and I've only yet read half of it. And Pollution is Colonialism isn't even available yet to my knowledge. Maybe you can pre-order it. We've always needed exactly this anti-supremacist kind of thinking from scholars who reject universalizing assumptions by showing how our bodies, homes, ecologies, geographies, and our planet are highly contingent formations. We have to heed the arguments of non-binary, transnational, indigenous, Black and brown feminists if we're ever to approach global change without reproducing the inequities that brought us to this precipice of multiple compounding crises in the first place. We must all do this reorientation as academics, no matter if we are in GWS or marine affairs or plant sciences or accounting. And we must do this at the centers of our disciplines, not at the margins. In environmental anthropology, my colleagues Sarah Bond, Rashi, and I proposed intersectional ecologies as more of an empathetic and ethical position than a theoretical framework. One goal of this work is to bring into focus how ecologies and ecological crises are historical and political projects. And an intersectional approach to ecologies enables us to examine the multiple agencies implicated in their formation. Further, our basic argument is that since geographies and ecologies are malleable and contingent social facts, it matters who is analyzing their formation, problematization, and the development of proposed solutions. And it matters how those processes are analyzed and witnessed. It matters where our scholarly frameworks and perspectives come from. I presented an autoethnographic path from my oblivious origins through the island-based research and current intersectional scholarship that shapes my work and sense of responsibility amidst the compounding crises of our era. I hope this talk might inspire you to continue to intentionally define your own positionality and purpose. What vital connections can you help make visible within the intersectional ecologies that shape your own work and life? Who are your guides on the path through the mess that we find ourselves in? How do you know who and where you are? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amelia. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you for articulating how intersectional thinking can help us get a better handle on the power structures at play or power dynamics at play in the projects and locations, in the projects you discussed and locations that you also described. So at this point, we'll start our question and answer segment. If there are questions, if anyone would like to share a comment or any questions, you can do so at this time in the comment section. And then I will read the question. We have a comment from Jolie Lisberger, who says, fabulous talk and ideas, Amelia. Wow, thank you. You're making me think about current attempts to take over lots of forested land. In West Greenwich, Richmond, Exeter, with fields of solar panels. Much of this is native land and totally spurred by profit as it destroys forested land. Care to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of that too, though you might know more of the details about it than I do. I don't know the ins and outs, but that's exactly the example of this kind of supremacist thinking, wherein these supposedly green movements are really just the same extractive practices in new guise. I think that fairly clear in this case, but I think we have to do a lot more to make sure other people can see that as well, because I think a lot of times people are blinded by the argument that, we're in such a state of crisis with global warming that it doesn't really matter how we lower our carbon emissions. Of course it matters how we do all this. It matters incredibly. It's essentially important that we think about how we actually do this and who is affected by it. I think, but thank you, Jody, for that.
And another question, can you provide more insights into the impact these projects, the projects you were discussing, have on the residents? For example, how do local women participate in these projects? How are they impacted?
I'm not sure if that means all of the 3 projects. I'm not sure if that question, I mean, I think part of an intersectional focus is to think beyond static categories, race, class, gender, sexuality, and to think explicitly about how those things are, as I said and others do, in too many words, interconnected, entangled. Let's say that. I'm trying not to give myself too many tongue twisters. And so, for example, there are some projects, conservation projects in the Bahamas, for example, that because of gender mainstreaming in conservation organizations have decided that they need to explicitly involve women in their outreach and design in ways that completely ignore the fact that, you know, one the biggest causes of certain forms of marine ecological degradation are tourism development, are climate change, ocean warming, ocean acidification, and all kinds of things that are really not local issues, not localized problems. And this targeting of making sure that, you know, women are empowered to make responsible choices about, like, marine resource use, for example, seems nice, it feels nice, it checks some boxes, but it doesn't actually address the issue, and is in fact, in some cases, kind of like scapegoating or a sideshow that distracts from the real issues. And so in those kinds of cases, I mean, of course it matters how different people are engaged in this work or affected by it, but I really don't want to miss the point, I think, of the kind of the larger concern. And I can say more about that if needed.
Mhm. Does anyone have any other questions they would like to ask our speaker? Well, so I'm not seeing any additional questions. I think, Amelia, if there are any additional comments you would like to make, otherwise we could end the talk.
Oh, sure. I have things I can say, but I think maybe I also have no idea, like, who is here or how many people are here. I have no sense of that.
Me either.
But the format might feel a little intimidating because we can't actually talk to you or see you or engage with you. So for that, I am sorry. But one thing I think want to stress to this audience, or whoever I imagine this audience might be, is that I think we need to do a better job of collaborating across our disciplinary silos. And that is something, as somebody who is, you know, trained in anthropology in the humanities, but who works in primarily in the College of Environment and with a lot of life sciences, natural scientists, and then who's gone back again to working with people in arts and sciences. I've found these collaborations incredibly productive and meaningful, and that when we do collaborate, we have a lot more power. It amplifies our voice. And so I really would like to extend the invitation to anybody who's interested to reach out to me, and let's figure out how we can collaborate, or let's figure out how we can collaborate with others, like build our transdisciplinary networks, because I think that's really where the rubber is going to meet the road when it comes to doing this kind of, or any kind of justice work in an academic institution. The silos keep us in our safe slots, and we can disrupt that, put it that way.
Yes, that is great, and gender women study in particular is, as a interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary discipline, it calls for collaboration and cross-pollination and things of that nature to try to expand knowledge and also justice. And any questions? Hi, Dr. Moore, amazing talk. How is a graduating senior about to embark into the marine science keep intersectionality at the forefront of research? This is a question from Sierra Gray.
Thank you, Sierra. That is a really great question, and I think it is one that you can pursue in a couple ways. One, I would continue to familiarize yourself with intersectional scholarship, particularly this burgeoning field of scholarship that is, I think, very much transforming and exploding the natural sciences and the environmental sciences. And so I'm happy to talk to you about more references there at any time to kind of keep you inspired. Another avenue you can take is making sure that you're graduating, but as an alum, you still have access to departments like Gender and Women's Studies, to the History Department, to Africana Studies. Like, keep in touch and attend those talks and seminars and workshops and things that are available to you that are open to the public. I would also say that you can, in the organizations that you go on to work with, you can be a disruptor yourself, or you can be a collaborator yourself. You can ask your colleagues and your bosses and the people, your networks to move to include more of these conversations. So you can be a tool in bringing these ideas with you wherever you go.
Excellent. Another question from, and maybe this will be our last question, from Jenna Panas. What collaborations would you like to see in the future?
I mean, that's a great question. And it really depends, I think, on the scale at which, I'm thinking. If I'm just thinking at the scale of our university, URI, I would love to see more of my colleagues in cells walk across the campus, so to speak, to work with it, but also just to listen to speakers and scholars in the arts and sciences and in other departments and programs, because I don't think that they often make time to do that, to understand what's going on, to understand what resources there are, to understand how transdisciplinary work, not just a mathematician talking to a chemist, but an ecologist talking to a women's studies scholar might actually transform and inspire them to consider research questions and to reconsider research questions in ways that they haven't been challenged to do. And so I'm really just hoping to see more time and space being made to have those conversations, just as a start.
Excellent. I want to thank Dr. Amelia Moore for this very informative talk. And I want to thank our audience and all the questions. And also would like to mention that there are other events coming up that may be of interest to you. Ongoing is the Centennial Suffrage Lecture Series, which with another event coming up on the 25th of this month. And then there are also future events before the end of the semester. And so I encourage you to look out for those, both for the suffrage series and also lectures from Gender and Women's Studies and other departments. I want to thank the audience for your participation. This has been an excellent experience. I look forward to having for future exchanges. Thank you so much.